Greetings and welcome to Part 4 of our Research 101 series. In the previous episodes, we've covered how to refine a research topic into a research question, the different types of information and how you can use them for research, and ways to query research databases and repositories to access the sources you need. In this segment, we're going to talk about how to evaluate the reliability of those sources. So you found some sources. Great. How do you know those sources are trustworthy? In our day-to-day life, there are a couple basic ways we determine the reliability of sources. We may decide to trust a source based on the reliability of the person who created it. We may decide that since the place the source was shared is trustworthy, we can rely on it. We may decide that based on the wild claims being made by a source, it's not trustworthy. Finally, we may decide that a source is so wildly and obviously biased, we cannot trust it. When dealing with sources for research projects, we use a similar set of criteria. We call it the CRAAP test. Now, just to get this out of the way, yes, the name is an acronym, but the pronunciation is intentional, as the goal of this test is to help you determine what sources are CRAAP and which ones aren't. Now, there are 5 elements to the CRAAP test, each of which consider one element that can help you tell whether or not your source is appropriate to use for your research. The first of these elements we're going to discuss is currency. When we're asking about currency, we're asking how recent the information is that the source contains. Generally speaking, the most recent information is preferred. Why? Well, things are always changing. In particular, when you're researching questions dealing with current events, the most recent information is going to be the most up-to-date, and therefore the best. When dealing with science, the most recent research is going to involve research done with the most advanced methods of observation and measurement, which may change our understanding of a variety of phenomena. Finally, and this is particularly the case when dealing with the social sciences, the earliest contributions to these fields represent assumptions, prejudices, and cultural mores consistent with the late 19th or early 20th centuries. As such, these sources make assumptions, or may make assumptions, that we now recognize as racist, sexist, or Eurocentric in nature. As such, they should not be used uncritically. It's important to point out here that currency is a relative thing depending on your discipline. A 5-year-old source in computer science could be considered ancient, while a 5-year-old source in psychology wouldn't raise any eyebrows. On the other hand, a 20-year-old article in psychology might be considered old, while an article published in the same year in certain areas of history would be considered just fine. So whether or not a source is current depends on the discipline in which it was published. In any case, when evaluating a source, the first question you should ask yourself is this the most up-to-date information available on this subject? The next area we need to consider is relevance. Now, when we're talking about relevance, what we're really asking is, does this source have anything to do with your topic? What we're trying to do here is avoid sources that are off-topic or irrelevant to the question you're trying to answer. For example, you may have found a fascinating article on the movie Napoleon Dynamite, but your paper is on Napoleon Bonaparte. So fascinating as the article might be, it fails the relevance test. Now, this is an extreme example, but you're going to end up coming up with a lot of potential sources that are irrelevant to your topic. So how do you determine whether a source is relevant? Well, there are a couple of tools that can help you. If you're going to look at a book or an ebook, read the introduction before you do anything else. In an academic book, the introduction is going to be where the author summarizes the arguments they're going to make in detail later on. If the introduction is irrelevant to your research question, there's a good chance the rest of the book isn't going to be much more helpful. When dealing with articles, a good practice is to always read the abstract before you choose to download the full text. The abstract is a short summary of what the article is about, which should help you determine whether or not it has anything to do with your research topic. Finally, in some databases, when you look at a page of search results, it will show you how many times an article has been cited. If an article is on your topic and has been cited multiple times, this means that other scholars have found this article useful in their own research, and it might be useful for yours as well. However, be careful when considering citation count as a measure of relevance, because it favors older articles. An article published 10 years ago has a far better chance of being highly cited than one published last week, regardless of their respective quality. However, if you find an article whose abstract suggests that it's relevant to your topic, and it happens to be highly cited, you might want to check it out. So, when you evaluate a source for relevance, ask yourself, does this source really have anything to do with my topic? The next area we need to consider when evaluating a source is authority. When we talk about authority, we're asking, did the person who created this source, wrote it, did the research, etc., know what they were talking about? And how can we tell? This can be a complicated question, as there are a lot of different ways to establish authority, and some of them only work under certain circumstances. For example, in academia, we convey authority through a degree and an area of specialization. So someone with a PhD in economics is someone who can be considered to give an authoritative answer on questions in that particular discipline. However, if said economics professor decides to give an opinion on quantum physics, it wouldn't be as authoritative as an argument made by a physicist. However, academic credentials are only one form of authority. Can you consider the case of Professor H and his father? Professor H is a historian with advanced degrees. His father, Mr. H, is an electrician who didn't finish college but has more than 30 years of experience in his field. Which of these two men do you want wiring your house? Obviously, you want Mr. H, whose experience trumps his son's education as the authoritative voice in this case. So in looking at sources, how do you pick the authoritative voice? That depends a lot on your question. In some cases, things will be easy. You're dealing with a scholarly question, so you will rely on scholarly sources written by experts with the proper academic credentials. In other cases, the authoritative voice may be the voice of experience, the individual being interviewed, the person who grew up within a specific culture or situation. It really depends on the context in which your question is being asked. In any case, when you encounter a source, you should ask yourself, does the creator of this source know what they're talking about, and how can I tell? The next area to consider is accuracy. When we ask about accuracy, what we're asking is, has this information been collected correctly, or are the facts or data presented being interpreted correctly? Accuracy is crucial, and inaccuracy can be expensive and catastrophic. As an example, consider the case of the Mars Surveyor probe in 1998. This NASA mission planned to send a spacecraft to Mars that would orbit the planet taking topographic measurements of the surface. However, the engineers who programmed the navigational software for the orbiter failed to convert some measurements between metric and non-metric units of measurement. As a result, the orbiter's computer made incorrect course corrections and either burned up in the Martian atmosphere or bounced off into space. Either way, NASA was out approximately $328 million over that mistake. So how do you know if the information you found is accurate? Well, when dealing with scholarly sources, the way we ensure accuracy is through the process of peer review. What is peer review? Peer review is basically academic quality control. When a scholar wants to publish their work in a scholarly journal, their work is submitted to a panel of scholars in that same area to review. They consider the work, judge whether or not it is accurate, objective, well-reasoned. If it's an experiment, they will check the methodology. At the end of the process, peer reviewers will either approve the article for publication, suggest revisions in order to have the article published, or reject the publication as it does not meet their standards. In order to cut down on bias and hopefully avoid scholars gaming the system, peer review is double-blind, meaning that the author doesn't know who their reviewers are, and the reviewers don't know who they are reviewing. So peer review isn't personal. It's intended as a way to ensure accuracy in scholarly publication. So when evaluating a source, you should be able to answer the following question. Is this information accurate, and how can I tell? Finally, there's the question of purpose. When we're asking about purpose, we're asking, why was this source created? Or, what was this source intended to accomplish? This is where we run into the problem of bias, and is where I have to let you in on a dirty little secret. There is no such thing as a totally unbiased source. Sources are created by human beings, and human beings have biases. So anything we create is, to one degree or another, going to reflect some of those biases. So when looking for sources, the goal isn't to look for a source that is bias-free, but rather a source where the ratio of fact to opinion falls in favor of the facts. The key to understanding this is to realize that all information sources were created with some kind of purpose in mind, and not all of those purposes are benign. Some sources are designed to educate or inform. Some sources are designed to sell you something. Some sources are designed to influence your opinions or decisions. In this last case, there are a variety of ways a source may try to influence you. It may try to make appeals through facts or evidence, or it may appeal to your emotions, particularly to fear or outrage. You should be very cautious of sources that attempt to influence you primarily through feelings, as this tends to be done to make up for a lack of evidence or to cover up a preponderance of evidence to the contrary. So in dealing with any source, but particularly with sources that haven't been subjected to peer review, ask yourself the following. Why was this source created? What were the goals of the creator of this source? Is this source attempting to influence my opinions? If so, is it using facts or emotions to do so? Chances are, if the source is attempting to influence you using only emotional appeals, it's not a credible source. To wrap up, when trying to determine if a source is credible, ask yourself the following questions. 1. Is this the most recent information on the topic? 2. Does this source have anything to do with your topic? 3. Does the person who created this source know what they're talking about, and how can I tell? 4. Is the information presented accurate, and how was this certified? And 5. Why was this source created? The answers to these questions will help you determine if a source is credible or if it's just crap.